Dr. John Torres here with my Daily Doc, where a couple times a week I go over headlines, particularly headlines concerning the pandemic, coronavirus, those things that we're looking at right now, and I get you some information behind those headlines, in particular things that hopefully you can use to help you, your family, your loved ones, and your community get through this pandemic sooner rather than later. And occasionally we put in other news items there as well. That way you have a better understanding of what's going on, not just with you, but around the world as well. And my main point is to try and get you information that you can use. Things, because sometimes those headlines can get confusing, but dig a little deeper into those headlines and what does it really mean? And then I answer questions you might have. So if you have questions, please send them our way so I can get to as many of those as possible. But let's start with the headlines. First and foremost, today, as we speak, the FDA's Advisory Committee, the VRBPAC they call it, which is the Vaccines and Related Biological Products Advisory Committee, is meeting. This is a group of experts that sit down when the vaccines are being presented for an emergency use authorization or for approval. In this case, the experts are sitting down going over Pfizer's data for their submission for an amendment to the emergency use authorization they have for children already, for older children, 12 to 15-year-olds. They're looking to amend it for 5 to 11 years old, and they're using data they've presented over the past couple of weeks that these experts have dug through, and now they're all discussing. And if you remember, this is a 4-stage process before shots can start being given to 5 to 11-year-olds, Pfizer shots. And the first stage is this VRBPAC, which I talked about. They're meeting today. They're going to take a vote at the end of the day. More than likely that vote will say, we recommend for the emergency use authorization. And actually, I will read you the question they have here. And the question is very, very straightforward. It says, let me find it here. Basically, this question is, based on the totality of scientific evidence available, do the benefits of the Pfizer-BioNTech COVID-19 vaccine, when administered as a 2-dose, 10 milligram each dose, 3 weeks apart, outweigh its risks to use in children 5 to 11 years of age? And remember, we're in the middle of a pandemic, so there's a lot of risks of not getting vaccinated and very minimal risks of getting the vaccine, so that's what they're looking at. So more than likely, the experts who are discussing it right now will vote to recommend. Up until now, the guess is it will be a unanimous vote. We'll see what happens. Once they vote to recommend, then it goes to the FDA commissioner, Dr. Woodcock, and she will vote. She will decide what to do, and she usually goes off the FDA's recommendation, the advisory committee recommendation. Almost always, there's been a couple instances where they haven't, but almost always the FDA commissioner goes off the recommendations. So assuming the FDA does that and the FDA gives it emergency use authorization, then it goes to step 3. Step 3 is the ACIP. That's the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices. That's the advisory committee to the CDC. They'll sit down and they'll essentially go over the who, what, when, where, all those different recommendations. Basically, who can get the vaccine. Again, Pfizer will have given emergency use authorization for 5 to 11 years old. What the CDC Advisory Committee can do is they can narrow those recommendations down, but they cannot expand them beyond what's already on there. And so they can say, yes, we agree 5 to 11 years old, or theoretically they could say, no, we only want 8 to 11 year olds or 5 to 8-year-olds. They might modify it, but more than likely they won't. And so the ACIP will sit down, they'll say, yes, 5 to 11-year-olds can get it. They get the 10 micrograms, they get it 3 weeks apart, they get it in this type of vial, they give out all the information. So as a doctor, I know how to give it, where to give it, when to give it, so that way we use the emergency use authorizations like it was meant to use. So once ACIP decides it, then the CDC director, Dr. Walensky, takes it and she signs off on that recommendation, or she modifies it. If you remember in the past when they were going for their emergency use authorization for the booster shots, originally they said they had certain categories, 2 categories, 65 and above, and those who had medical conditions that put them at a higher risk of COVID complications. They did not, the committee did not, or the advisors did not recommend doing anything as far as those who work in jobs that put them at a high risk of catching COVID. Well, Dr. Walensky said, well, based on what the VRBPAC said, based on what the FDA said, and based on the vote, which was not unanimous from the CDC Advisory Committee, I'm going to go ahead and add them as well. So she added that third group, those who work in situations or live in situations that put them at higher risk, and that has been of catching COVID, and that has been what's been going on ever since. And so again, 4-step process. VRBPAC meets today. FDA commissioner goes off their recommendation and potentially signs off on it, which more than likely she will. And then ACIP, the advisory committee, meets next week. And then once the advisory committee, it's a 2-day meeting, once they get through their recommendations, they give it to the CDC director and she signs off on it. So that means By the end of next week, theoretically, if everything goes according to plans, then the Pfizer vaccine for 5 to 11 years old will have an emergency use authorization and the recommendation from the CDC, and shots can start being given next week. Now, you have to remember, too, this is a 5-week process to get fully vaccinated. Get the shot day 0, 3 weeks later, you get the second shot, and 2 weeks after that, you're fully vaccinated. So 5 weeks. So the hope is that if people start getting, if children start getting that first or second week of November, by Christmas time, by holiday season, they are fully vaccinated. And more importantly, fully vaccinated before they get off into school next year. Now, why is this important? Now, if you remember at the beginning of the pandemic, there were a lot of discussions about children and how much COVID affected children. And the common saying among experts was that, yes, COVID did not seem to affect them as much as adults. They weren't getting hospitalized as much, and they weren't dying from it. But what also experts were saying when you got behind that initial headline was, yes, it does affect them. They do have cases. They do get hospitalized. And 100+ children have died from COVID. And so it is a deadly disease for them. As a matter of fact, the AAP, the American Academy of Pediatrics, just came out with information, and as of a week ago, 117,000 children had COVID cases for that last week. That is a 4% increase over a couple-week period before, and that is also 25% of all the cases that are out there are in children. So this is a group that we know can catch it, we know can spread it, and cannot get vaccinated at this time, but hopefully by the end of next week, they can start getting vaccinated, which will go a long ways towards keeping them protected, keeping their families, their schools, and their communities protected as well. And so let's see what happens with this, and I'll give you more information over my subsequent Daily Doctor lives, Facebook Lives here. Now, the other thing to remember again is that when they presented the data, we talked about all the data they did on the human trials they did for 5 to 11 years old. There were a little over 2,000, a little over 2,200 5 to 11-year-olds that were in this trial. 2/3 of them ended up getting the vaccine. 1/3 got a placebo. They compared the two, and they found out the effectiveness was 90.7, almost 91%, 2.5 months after getting that vaccine. And that's in the midst of the Delta virus being out there, this Delta mutation and variant. So this is showing a very good effectiveness against the Delta variant and the variants that are out there. On top of that, when I looked at side effects, but you have to remember, it was a smaller study, 1,500 or so ended up getting the vaccine. No cases of myocarditis, even in boys. No cases of Bell's palsy. Minimal side effects, similar to that in 12 years old and above that are getting it. And they basically sore arms, fevers, feeling a little tired, the typical things if you've gotten a vaccine that you know happen. And so moving forward, what they're looking at is the third dose, the 1/3 of the dose that adults get, getting it at 3-week increments, day 0, 3 weeks later, and then being fully protected 2 weeks after that. So a total of 5 weeks. More than likely, Moderna will follow behind that. Johnson & Johnson, we'll see as their data gets presented where they go. But we'll see what happens today with the VRBPAC, the advisory committee to the FDA, and then as it goes from there through the different steps. So that is the vaccines here in the booster and the vaccines for children. Now, the other one is international travel. That's a huge one that's out there too, because up until now, you could only come here to the U.S. from other countries if you had a compelling reason. If, for example, military, you're here on military orders, those types of things, diplomatic type situations. But for the average person, especially for leisure travel, could not do it. Well, starting November 8th, the White House has said they're going to open it up to leisure travel, any kind of travel, for fully vaccinated people from other countries. But the vaccines have to be either CDC or World Health Organization approved. And if you look at the vaccines, at the list of vaccines, that is the majority of vaccines that are out there, with the exception of, if you look on the CDC site, Sputnik, the Russian vaccine, is not on there. Although some news organizations have said that will be included as well. But as of now, what they presented for what's going to happen November 8th, that Sputnik vaccine is not on there. The other good thing is mix and match is on there. So what they're saying is you can go ahead and you can mix and match. It's a variety of different vaccines that you have there. And so as long as you're getting vaccines that are in their criteria, if you're from another country, you can come here. If you're from another country, or even if you're from the U.S. and you travel back, now the big difference being if you're from the U.S. and you travel back, you're a U.S. citizen, you don't have to be fully vaccinated, but there are different rules. So fully vaccinated people, whether from the U.S. or not U.S., also have to get a PCR test, a COVID test, within 72 hours, 3 days of traveling to the U.S. And so that gives you a big window to do it. Having come back from Europe, that's exactly what you need, because it does take some time to get those test results back. And when you go to the airport, first thing they ask you, show us your COVID test. Now, the other thing they're saying is if you're an American citizen, a U.S. citizen, but not vaccinated, that test has to be within 1 day, 24 hours, which is going to be a little bit more difficult to get, probably a little bit more expensive as well. And so yet another reason to get fully vaccinated. So this all starts November 8th. And then the last thing I want to talk about are the numbers. So right now here in the U.S., the numbers are trending down, and we're around 70,000, which is great. And that has been a big drop over the last month or so, which is fantastic. And by all indications, and what experts are predicting, is another big drop coming up over here over the next month or so. But you have to remember, too, that we've been through this before. This is not our first rodeo, as they say. This is our fourth big surge we've had, the fourth upsweep of cases. And the concern is when these cases drop down, will they go back up again since we're going into the holidays and people will start traveling? The general consensus is probably not, because more people are vaccinated and people are taking some cautions, not as many as we'd like them to, but they are taking some precautions to try and prevent the spreading of COVID. And so the hope is these cases don't go up with both children being vaccinated, more adults having the vaccine on board than they did the last few upswings in cases. But at the same time, you do have to concern yourself with it. And the perfect example is the UK. So right now, the UK is having a big upswing in cases. And the reason they think they're having them is a couple. One is they have completely opened everything up. As the UK says, as Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, has said, they need to learn to live with COVID is what they're trying to do. And what that's showing is once they fully opened everything up, these numbers go up. Part of it has to do with their vaccine rate, not as high as they'd like. Plus, they ended up getting the vaccines early on in the pandemic, as soon as vaccines were approved, so that might be wearing off a little bit. Plus, there's some interesting things going on there. One of the things that happened there was called a program called Eat Out, Help Out, which happened in August of 2020, which was interesting. So from August 3rd to August 31st, the UK government said, we want, if you remember, that's when things were getting better under control. Even here in the US, we're talking about 11,000 to 20,000 cases a day. Things were looking really good. We were talking about light at the end of the tunnel. And then we went to winter months where it showed that that was actually the opposite of what was happening. Well, here in the UK, same thing. They did this Eat Out to Help Out. They're giving people 10 euros, which is about $14, to go to bars or restaurants and eat indoors. And that you could do that as many times during the day as you wanted to. Well, they found out that when this happened, there was an 11% increase in cases. And of those 11% increase, a lot of them could be traced to the bars and restaurants. As a matter of fact, before this, 5% of the cases were because of bars or restaurant. Once this was instilled, 20% became bars or restaurant cases. And so that's a fourfold increase. And right after this happened, once that 31st of August, it stopped being an issue there. It stopped being a policy they had, and they stopped paying for these restaurant and bar tabs. The cases started coming down again. So it's showing that we need to be careful. We need to be judicious about how we handle these things and realize that even though things are getting better, we're not completely out of the pandemic yet. So again, went over the meeting, what's happening with 5 to 11 years old and how that process is working. International travel, 8 November is the ticket for people coming here to the U.S. from other countries if they're fully vaccinated. And the numbers are going down. We need to make sure they do continue to go down. But now, let me see if you guys have any questions.
Will children younger than 5 years old have an even smaller dose of the vaccine then? Is that similar to other common vaccines given to babies?
And that is similar to vaccines that are different for different age groups. And one of the big questions I always get is, what if I have a very, a more mature 4-year-old versus a 5-year-old who's not as mature? In other words, they weigh more than the other one. Or, for example, if I have an 11-year-old that weighs more than my 12-year-old, which one family actually asked me the question, why are the dosings different? Why is it not weight-based? Well, when it comes to oral medications, for the most part, we do weight-based medications for oral medication because it has to do with how it digests into our body and how it gets into the system through the liver and processes into our bloodstream. When it comes to vaccines, those go directly into the muscle and they affect the immune system. So with vaccines, it's not so much weight-based as it is immune system maturity. And that is, regardless of weight, is typical at these ages. And so that's why they broke them up into the age groups. But more than likely, children under the age of 5 will probably get a smaller dose, but that's what they're looking into right now. And they're also looking into, do they still need to give 2 shots? They need to give it 3 weeks apart. Does it need to be spaced closer or further apart? Because one thing we do know, and I've mentioned this many times, children are not just small adults, so we can't assume the same intervals, the same dosing, the same spacing as they would with adults. And we found that out with 5 to 11 years old, it's different. Well, it's even going to be possibly different for that 6-month to 5-year-old range that they're looking at. And what they're going to do is break it down into 2 different ranges, 2 to 5 years old or 2 to 4-year-olds, and then 6 month to 2-year-olds. Could be different dosings there. We'll see as time goes on. Probably not going to happen until early next year, though.
What about AstraZeneca? When will we see that? Will we ever see that in the U.S.?
So AstraZeneca was the one developed out of Oxford, and it's been used extensively in the UK. And AstraZeneca is the same type of vaccine as Johnson & Johnson. It's what we call an adenovirus vector vaccine. And it had some of the similar problems that Johnson & Johnson did with the rare cases of blood clots, and the efficacy, especially against the Delta variant, didn't seem to be as high as we would have liked it to be. So more than likely, we're not going to see it here in the U.S. for a couple reasons. Number one, we have Pfizer, we have Moderna, we have Johnson & Johnson. We have plenty of those. Novavax is another one that has been coming around, and right now the data is not all complete there, but more than likely that'll be the 4th one if we do get a 4th one. And so AstraZeneca probably won't be a vaccine we see in the near future here in the U.S., if at all. But again, plenty of vaccines out there: Moderna, Pfizer, Johnson & Johnson, and then Novavax is the next one coming down the pipeline here. So keep an eye out for those. And the same goes for children as well. It'll probably be those vaccines that we're dealing with. And again, there have been plenty of vaccines out there. The government says we have plenty of vaccines to cover people, not just for the 2 doses they need for Pfizer, Moderna, or the 1 dose for Johnson & Johnson, but also for the subsequent booster shots. And now for those 5 to 11 years old, they're starting to gin those up as well. And one of the things I did forget to mention is the White House has already put in mechanisms to make sure that they can get these vaccines as soon as it gets the emergency use authorization and the CDC recommendation, as soon as hopefully the end of next week. And they talk to pharmacies, are going to start stocking them. They're going to have different areas where they're doing mass vaccinations, but not quite like at the beginning of last year. There'll still probably be a rush at the beginning to get the 5 to 11-year-olds vaccinated, but that'll probably calm off pretty soon. They're also looking at doctors' offices to give them as well. And so we'll see what happens as time goes on here, but it looks like they're starting to put the mechanisms in place, starting to get the vaccines out there and pushed out there. And for those who are wondering, so when it comes to boosters for Pfizer, Moderna, all those, the boosters are typically, well, Moderna is the one that's a half a dose of the regular vaccine. And so it's the same vial. They're just, as providers, we just draw half a dose instead of a full dose for a booster shot. Well, with this, to avoid confusion, they've changed the cap colors, they've changed the vials, the way they look. And so that way there isn't so much confusion over, is this a 5 to 11-year-old dose or is this a 12-plus dose? They want to make sure that that dosing is very specific for those individuals to make sure they're getting the right one, because they want to make sure it's safe, they want to make sure it's effective, they want to make sure it helps get the pandemic over with as soon as possible. So again, thank you very much. These have been fantastic questions as always, and I appreciate them. And this is early in the week. I'll let you know Friday what happens with these various entities that are meeting and the emergency use authorization, and then we'll go from there. So thank you very much. Have a great week.